There is a story most people think they already know. They have heard the name Johnson & Johnson their entire lives. It sits on the bandage tin in the medicine cabinet, on the powder in the nursery, on the bottles of shampoo lined up in the shower. It is one of the most familiar names in the American consumer landscape, which is precisely why so few people have ever stopped to ask what happened to the family behind it. Not what happened to the company, which is easy enough to trace through quarterly earnings reports and corporate histories, but what happened to the people who did not build that company and were not responsible for any of its success and were not equipped by anything the company had ever produced to receive what it left them. What happened to the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the men who had turned a rented factory in New Jersey into one of the most valuable healthcare corporations in the world? The answer to that question is not simple, and it is not the story the company's official history tells. It is a story about the particular way wealth operates across generations when the people holding it have no particular purpose for it beyond holding it. It is a story about what happens when one man builds something extraordinary and then spends the second half of his life trying to control who benefits from it and what ripples out from that attempt at control through 5 generations of people who never asked to be enrolled in the consequences of his ambition. Some of them found their way through. Some of them did not survive it. All of them were shaped by a fortune they did not earn, managed by instruments designed to last forever, and distributed by a system that understood compounding interest very well and human beings not well enough. The family became, in the estimation of the people who studied it closely, perhaps the most dramatically dysfunctional in the Fortune 500, a designation that says something specific about what enormous inherited wealth without purpose tends to produce across time. The bandages kept selling through all of it. Before we get into the story, welcome if you are new here, and welcome back if you have been watching for a while. We make these long-form documentaries for the quiet hours, and tonight we are going deep into one of the most extraordinary family stories in American history. If you enjoy this content, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you never miss one of these, and drop us a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. Now let us go back to the beginning of all of it, to 3 brothers in a rented building in New Jersey, and an idea that changed the world. New Brunswick, New Jersey in 1886. 3 brothers set up a small factory in a rented building on Neilson Street, near the railroad tracks, in a town that had a modest industrial character and no particular reason to be where history began. Their names were Robert Wood Johnson, James Wood Johnson, and Edward Meade Johnson. They were the sons of a Pennsylvania farmer named Sylvester Johnson, which meant they had grown up without wealth and without the assumptions that wealth installs in people from birth. What they had instead was a specific practical idea about something the world needed and was not getting reliably. The idea had come from a British surgeon named Joseph Lister, who had spent years arguing that wound infections, which were killing hospital patients in numbers that should have been preventable, were being spread by dirty surgical tools and unsterile dressings. Lister had developed a system for antiseptic wound care, and the evidence for his approach was strong enough that by the 1870s, it was becoming difficult to ignore. Robert Wood Johnson had attended a lecture Lister gave in Philadelphia in 1876 at the International Medical Congress, and the argument had lodged itself in his mind with the kind of force that arguments only achieve when the person hearing them is already predisposed to act on them. Sterile, ready-to-use surgical dressings, sealed and packaged before they ever reach the operating room. No contamination from handling, no guesswork about whether the gauze was clean. The product would arrive sterile, and it would stay sterile until the moment it was needed. That was the business. It was not glamorous, but it was correct. And in 1886, almost no one was doing it at any commercial scale. The brothers opened the factory with 14 employees, 8 women, and 6 men. They manufactured sterile sutures, absorbent cotton, surgical gauze, and medicated plasters. They published a guide called Modern Methods of Antiseptic Wound Treatment, which they distributed to medical professionals across the country, not just as advertising but as genuine education, as a way of building the market by building the knowledge that made the market necessary. The guide was sent to 85,000 doctors and pharmacists in its first year. This was not merely clever marketing. It was a recognition that the product's value depended on its users understanding what it was for and why the sterility mattered. That selling something revolutionary required first convincing the people who would use it that the revolution had happened. By early 1888, the company was generating $25,000 a month in revenue, which was an extraordinary number for a factory that had started with nothing but a rented building and a borrowed idea. The growth did not stop there. Johnson & Johnson hired a local pharmacist named Frederick Kilmer as its scientific director, and Kilmer brought with him both a talent for innovation and a talent for communicating what that innovation meant. He introduced one of the company's first medical research laboratories. He oversaw improvements to the industrial sterilization process that made the products more reliable and faster to produce. He also had a small domestic incident that changed the company's product line entirely. His son James developed a skin irritation from adhesive medical dressings, and Kilmer began including a small packet of Italian talcum powder in the company's kits as a way of addressing the problem. Customers began requesting the powder separately. The company packaged it as its own product. Johnson's baby powder was born from a rash and a father's concern, and it sold in numbers that eventually made it one of the most recognized consumer products in the world. By the early 1890s, they had introduced the first commercial first aid kits, designed initially for workers on the railroads who were regularly injured on the job. Those kits spread quickly into homes and schools and workplaces. The Band-Aid arrived in 1920, born out of another domestic problem. A company employee named Earl Dixon had a wife who kept cutting her fingers in the kitchen, and he combined adhesive tape with a small gauze pad so she could dress the wounds herself. And Johnson & Johnson marketed the result in a way that made it indispensable within a few years. Baby oil came, baby shampoo, dental floss. Each product was a variation on the same original insight, that clean, reliable, accessible medical and personal care was something ordinary people needed, and that no one had yet made properly available to them in a convenient form. Each one sold by the millions. Each one added to a revenue base that kept growing decade after decade, through depressions and wars and the constant shifting of consumer preferences, regardless of what was happening in the wider world. The company grew in the way of very few companies, not by changing what it fundamentally was, but by expanding the territory that its original idea covered, finding new applications for the same essential proposition that clean things kept people healthier than dirty ones. It was a simple idea, and it turned out to be inexhaustible. Robert Wood Johnson, the founding brother, died in 1910 at the age of 64 in New Brunswick of kidney disease, not far from the factory where the company had started. He left behind an institution already substantially larger than anything he had envisioned in that rented building in 1886. The company had by that point expanded beyond New Jersey into other states and had begun its first international operations. It was producing dozens of products across multiple categories. It employed hundreds of people. It was, by any reasonable standard, a success story of the first order. He also left behind a son who would take what his father built and expand it into something the world could barely have imagined, and who would in doing so create the exact conditions that would damage his own family across 4 generations in ways that no amount of the company's success could repair. The relationship between what the general built and what it cost the people closest to him is the central tension of the entire Johnson family story, and it begins with a 16-year-old boy whose father had just died, standing at the entrance of a family business that was already his responsibility before he had decided whether he wanted it. He was born in New Brunswick in 1893. His name was Robert Wood Johnson II, though for most of his adult life people called him by a different name. His father died when he was 16, leaving him an estate of approximately $2 million and a company that needed leadership. He did not go to college. He went instead to work, starting on the factory floor alongside the men who manufactured the products, learning the company from the bottom of it with the intensity of someone who understood from adolescence that this inheritance was also a set of demands. He worked his way upward. He became vice president of Johnson & Johnson in 1918. He became president in 1932, chairman of the board in 1938. During the Second World War, he accepted a commission as a brigadier general in the United States Army and served on the War Production Board, overseeing government contracts for thousands of smaller American companies whose survival during the wartime economy depended on those contracts reaching them. He carried the title for the rest of his life, and everyone who worked with him or came into his orbit called him the General from that point forward. The name fit him in ways that went considerably beyond the military service. Under his leadership, Johnson & Johnson transformed from a domestic medical supply company into an international healthcare corporation. He guided the company through the Depression by keeping every employee on payroll and actually raising wages at a moment when every economic incentive pointed in the opposite direction. He wrote and circulated among business leaders a document arguing that corporations had obligations to their workers and their communities that preceded the obligation to shareholders, a position that was strikingly unconventional for the era and that anticipated the conversation about corporate responsibility by several decades. The document he wrote became the basis for the company's credo, which Johnson published in 1943 and which guided the company's decisions long after he was gone. In 1982, when capsules of Tylenol were tampered with in Chicago and several people died, Johnson & Johnson's swift and transparent response, pulling the product immediately and cooperating fully with authorities, was widely credited to the institutional culture that the General had built around that credo. His vision for what a corporation should be had taken root deeply enough to survive him by 14 years and still work. He was a man of genuine principle. He was also a man who fired his own son from the company in 1965 and his nephew in 1962. He married 3 times and divorced twice. He ran Johnson & Johnson with an absolutism that left very little room for independent thinking, for disagreement, or for anyone else's idea of how things should be done. The people who worked for him either accepted this or they were removed, not always with cruelty, but with the clean efficiency of a man who understood that the organization he was running had no use for people who could not fully commit to it. His family either conformed to his expectations or they were managed from a distance. He was not a cruel man in the simple sense. He was a man who had acquired, through decades of building something very large and very successful, a settled conviction that his judgment was correct and that deviation from it was a form of error to be corrected. This is a personality type that produces excellent companies. The General's record as a business leader was genuinely remarkable. He grew Johnson & Johnson from a domestic medical supply company into an international corporation with operations in dozens of countries. He wrote the credo. He kept his workers employed through the Depression. He served the government during the war with the same totalizing commitment he brought to everything else. He did everything right in the places where his particular gifts applied. It is also a personality type that tends to produce families in which the children grow up shaped by their relationship to an authority they cannot meet and cannot escape, in which the emotional temperature of every significant relationship is set by the same person who sets every other standard, in which love is conditional in a way that may not be conscious, but that registers in the people on the receiving end of it as something they can never quite earn their way out of. The General's relationship with his own son Bobby was the clearest illustration. He fired Bobby from the company in 1965. By that point, Bobby was in his mid-40s. He had worked for the company his grandfather had founded and his father had built. He had done what was expected of him and found himself still, in the end, insufficient. The General left the bulk of his $400 million estate not to his family, but to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. His children had already been provided for in the trusts he had established. This was his reasoning. It was not wrong exactly, but it meant that the last significant act of his life reinforced the message that had been present in every earlier act, that the institution came first, that the money was a tool for the institution's purposes, and that his children were already taken care of in the financial sense, which was the only sense the instruments he had designed addressed. The financial decisions the General made in the 1940s were the ones that reached furthest into the family's future. As Johnson & Johnson was preparing for its initial public offering on the New York Stock Exchange in 1944, the General established a series of generation-skipping trust funds for the grandchildren of himself and his brother Seward. Each trust was seeded with 15,000 shares of Johnson & Johnson stock, then valued at approximately $500,000 per trust. The instruments were modeled closely on the trusts the Rockefeller family had used, and they were designed with a ferocious durability. The beneficiaries could not touch the principal, they could not break the trusts or dissolve them. They could not sell the underlying shares or redirect the investments. The stock would compound in perpetuity, year after year and decade after decade, regardless of what any individual heir needed or wanted or decided. The general had stipulated further that when any beneficiary died without children, their share would pass to the surviving siblings. He wanted the wealth to stay concentrated. He wanted it to compound. He understood very well what compounding did to money over time, and he had structured the trusts to take maximum advantage of it. A block of 100 shares sold in 1944 for $3,750. By the end of the 20th century, that same block was worth $12 million. The trusts the general established for the grandchildren of the family, seeded at $500,000 each, had grown by the 1970s and 80s into fortunes approaching $600 million per beneficiary. The compounding had done exactly what compounding does when nothing interferes with it and the underlying asset keeps appreciating. He had succeeded by the purely financial measure he had set for himself beyond any reasonable prediction. The wealth was intact. The wealth was growing. The wealth was protected from fragmentation and from expenditure in ways that made it almost impossible to deplete. Every year the stock market returned something, and every year the trust grew larger, and the people whose names were attached to the trust did nothing to produce this outcome, except continue to exist. This was the system working as designed. The problem is not that the system failed. The problem is that the system succeeded completely, and in doing so produced a set of human consequences that the system had no way to address. The general had been an engineer of extraordinary ability when it came to financial instruments. He understood compounding. He understood generation-skipping mechanisms. He understood the Rockefeller model and adapted it with precision. What he had not engineered, because it is not a thing that can be engineered through legal documents, was the relationship between a person and their work that makes a life feel meaningful. He had removed, for every beneficiary of those trusts, the ordinary pressure of financial necessity that tends to push people toward finding out what they can do and what they are worth. He had replaced that pressure with a permanent, unconditional, and growing financial cushion. And the people who received that cushion had to figure out, without much help from any source, what a person is supposed to do when the question of survival has been answered before it was ever asked. Some of them found answers, many did not. The ones who did not paid costs that no trust fund was designed to account for. John Seward Johnson, the first, the general's younger brother known through his life as Seward, was not a builder in the way his brother was. He was the softer presence, the one who deferred to the general's judgment, who followed his brother's lead in business matters, who was controlled rather than controlling. Together, the two brothers held 84% of Johnson & Johnson's stock in the years before the public offering, a concentration of ownership that gave the general effective sovereignty over the company and made Seward's acquiescence to that sovereignty both necessary and, by most accounts, more or less willing. Seward was described by people who knew him as a man who was charming in a way his brother was not, warmer in his personal interactions, easier to be around in an ordinary social setting. The general commanded rooms. Seward occupied them with something closer to ease. But the ease was also a kind of vacancy, an absence of the organizing conviction that his brother had in such abundance. In his private life, Seward moved very differently from his brother. He married 3 times. His first marriage to a Bermuda woman named Ruth Dill produced 4 children, Mary Leah, Elaine, Seward Jr., and Diana. That marriage ended in divorce around 1937. His second marriage, to a woman named Esther Underwood, added 2 more children, Jennifer and James Loring. That marriage also ended. The pattern of Seward's personal life was one of intense beginning and eventual fracture, of relationships that started with consuming energy and could not sustain themselves over years and decades. As a teenager in the early years of the 20th century, Seward had been, by multiple accounts that surface long after the fact, abandoned by his parents and left in the company of a New York socialite who used the boy in ways that left psychological marks that were never fully addressed. The consequence of that early experience expressed itself throughout the whole of his adult life in a particular way. He was a man who sought closeness with an intensity that made him vulnerable, who needed to feel genuinely cared for in a way that his position and his fortune made difficult to find in any uncomplicated form. The people who entered his orbit, whether wives or employees or friends, were dealing with a man whose emotional needs were real and whose resources for meeting them through ordinary relationship had been damaged before he was old enough to protect himself. He funded the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution in Fort Pierce, Florida, because he loved the sea and wanted something to pour himself into beyond the social world his wealth provided. He built an estate in Princeton, New Jersey called Jasna Polana, 46,000 square feet of it, because he had the means and the desire and no real reason to restrain either. He collected art with genuine seriousness, building a collection worth $50 million. The art was not merely decorative accumulation. He had genuine taste and genuine knowledge, the kind that came from serious looking over many years. But the estate and the art and the Oceanographic Institute were all, in some sense, attempts to give shape and meaning to a life that the fortune made materially frictionless and existentially complicated. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, a man looking for something he could never quite name, seeking warmth and closeness, and the feeling of being genuinely cared for, and finding those things difficult to sustain in any of the structures his life offered. In 1968, at the age of 73, Seward hired a young Polish immigrant named Barbara Piasecka to work in his household as a cook and maid. She had arrived in the United States with $100 and no English. She had studied art history in Wrocław, had left Poland under the weight of the communist regime, had spent time studying in Rome, and had found her way eventually to New Jersey and the Johnson household. Her name was Basia. She was 31 years old. Within a year of her arrival, she had left the household to take art courses at New York University, and Seward had followed her. He rented her an apartment and moved in. By 1971, he had divorced Esther Underwood, the mother of his two youngest children, and married Basia 8 days after the divorce was finalized. Not one of his 6 children attended the ceremony. The marriage lasted until his death, and whatever else could be said about it, it held in a way that his previous marriages had not. He was devoted to her. He built a world around her interests and her presence. She gave him, or he felt she gave him, the particular kind of care and attention that he had been seeking through 3 marriages and several decades. Seward died in Fort Pierce, Florida, in May of 1983 at the age of 87. He had signed his final will 1 month before his death. The will left virtually his entire estate to Basia. The estate was worth approximately $400 million. His 6 children from his 2 earlier marriages were excluded from the will almost entirely, notwithstanding the trust fund distributions the general had established for them decades earlier. The children were not poor. They were already millionaires through the trusts. But being a millionaire and being left out of a $400 million estate when you are the dead man's children are different feelings, and the feelings were not abstract. The children had also spent years watching their father recede from their lives behind the wall of his marriage to Basia, watching the estate at Jasna Polana be remade according to her tastes and interests, watching the Oceanographic Institution their father had funded begin to feel like a distant memory of the man they had known before she arrived. The will was not a surprise. It was still a wound. The children contested the will. They argued their father had lacked mental competence when he signed it. They argued that Basia had isolated an elderly and increasingly frail man from his family and leveraged his dependence on her to obtain a will that reflected her interests rather than his authentic wishes. The legal battle that followed is described in the historical record as the longest and most expensive contested will proceeding in American legal history up to that point. It lasted 3 months in a New York courtroom and cost $25 million in legal fees before a settlement was reached in 1986. The courtroom proceedings revealed things about the Johnson family's internal history that the family's habitual silence had kept private for generations. Accusations of extortion emerged. Stories of neglect and manipulation circulated in testimony and in the press. One of Seward's daughters, Mary Leah, whose infant face had appeared on the first can of Johnson's baby powder, and who had herself accumulated a $100 million trust fund by this point, had her own deeply troubled personal history pulled into the proceedings. The case became, in a way that lawsuits rarely do, a comprehensive accounting of everything the family had hidden behind its considerable wealth and its considerable reserve. Each of the 6 Johnson children received roughly $6 million in additional funds from the settlement. The Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution, which Seward had also excluded from his final will despite his decades of support for it, received $20 million. Basia kept approximately $340 million. She converted Jasna Polana into a private golf club and relocated to Europe. Forbes ranked her among the 149th richest people in America in 2007. She died in Poland in 2013. The lawsuit had not changed the essential outcome for any of the parties, but it had dragged the family's internal wounds into the most public possible forum. Every skeleton that could be removed from the Johnson family closet had been removed in the presence of reporters and a courtroom audience. What remained after the settlement was a family with somewhat more money than before and considerably fewer illusions about what that money could hold together. John Seward Johnson II, who went by Seward Jr., and who eventually became known to the wider world simply as the sculptor Seward Johnson, was born in New Brunswick on April 16, 1930. He was the eldest son of Seward I and Ruth Dill, and his childhood was shaped by forces over which he had no control and about which he would not speak clearly until much later in his life. His parents divorced when he was around 7 years old. His mother was a Bermuda woman from a family of some standing, but not the Johnson variety of standing, and after the divorce, the children's lives were organized by the logistics of the Johnson family's wealth without being particularly warmed by it. He was dyslexic in an era when dyslexia was not understood as a neurological difference, but was treated as a failure of effort or intelligence. He attended a school in Connecticut, the University of Maine, and then the Navy during and after the Korean War. He came home in the mid-1950s and took a job at Johnson & Johnson, the company his grandfather had helped found, the institution his uncle, the general, had spent decades building into an international corporation. He worked there through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, learning what he could learn, doing what was asked of him, trying to find a footing in a place that had not been designed for someone like him. In 1962, his uncle, the general, fired him. The official reason was professional performance. What the firing actually represented, by the accounts of people who observed it, was the general's impatience with anyone whose gifts did not map onto the company's needs and whose nature resisted the kind of total compliance the general required from the people around him. Seward Jr. found himself at 32 with substantial inherited wealth, no company to work for, and no clear idea of what he was for. He was, in his own description, a man with nowhere to go and no way to get there. For someone without the trust funds, this moment would have forced a reckoning with practical necessity and would probably have produced a quicker resolution. The trust funds removed the practical necessity and left only the existential one, which is a harder problem and a less well-marked path. He spent several years in that particular uncertainty before finding his way out of it. What he found arrived almost by accident, through an advertisement for an art class, one of the most ordinary encounters possible, and he attended and discovered that he was capable of something he had not known about himself. He began with painting. He moved to sculpture, to the specific form of large-scale, hyper-realistic, figurative bronze that would define his entire career from that point forward. His sculptures depicted ordinary people doing ordinary things. A businessman on a park bench bent over his briefcase with the focused attention of someone who has not noticed the pigeons or the weather or the time. A couple sharing a moment of conversation. A child in mid-reach. The figures were cast in bronze and painted with a precision that made them, at a quick glance in public spaces, almost indistinguishable from living people. They were installed in parks and plazas and city corners across America and around the world. Critics were divided about the work. Some found it democratic and accessible and genuinely moving in the way that art which celebrates ordinary life can be moving. Others found it sentimental, derivative, a sophisticated reproduction of reality rather than a transformation of it. Seward Johnson received all of this with a considerable equanimity and kept making the work regardless. What he built around the work went well beyond the sculptures themselves. He established the Johnson Atelier in Hamilton, New Jersey in 1974, a technical foundry and training facility for sculptors that became one of the most sophisticated and well-equipped institutions of its kind anywhere in the world. Artists from around the world sent their work to the atelier to be cast because the facility and the expertise there were genuinely exceptional. Working in isolation from major commercial foundries, he had created something that functioned as a genuine resource for other artists, a place where the technical demands of large-scale bronze fabrication could be met without the compromises that commercial facilities often imposed. He then converted 42 acres of former state fairground land in Hamilton into grounds for sculpture, an outdoor museum presenting contemporary art to audiences in a region of New Jersey where access to major cultural institutions was limited. He did not build grounds for sculpture as a monument to himself. He built it as a place where art could be encountered by ordinary people in an open setting, without the formality of a gallery or the expense of a major urban museum. The museum is still operating today. It is still presenting exhibitions on 42 acres in Hamilton, New Jersey to the public. It was built by a man who had been fired from his family's company and had nothing obvious to do next, and who used the fortune the general had structured with such controlling care to construct something that served people entirely outside the family's concerns. This is the most significant thing that separates Seward Jr.'s story from the stories of the other heirs. He had a use for the money that required his own particular gifts to pursue that could not have been built by anyone else with the same amount of money but different interests. That was genuinely his in a way the trust fund never was. Of all the uses the Johnson fortune was put to across 5 generations, this one sits most clearly on the side of the ledger that justifies the word legacy. Seward Johnson died in Key West, Florida on March 10, 2020 at the age of 89, from cancer. He had outlived almost everyone of his generation. He had outlived Casey Johnson by 10 years. He had outlived the lawsuit and the legal fees and the bitterness and the settlement and the silence. The institutions he built outlived him too. The general's son, Robert Wood Johnson III, known as Bobby, occupies the middle of this story in a way that is difficult to characterize cleanly. He was not the architect of the family's dysfunction, and not the most visible victim of it. He was the generation between the man who built the structure and the children who were most damaged by what the structure contained. Bobby Johnson did not have his father's capacity for command. He was not a builder in the way the general had been, not a visionary who could see around corners and organize other people's efforts toward a coherent end. He was a man living inside an institution of enormous expectation and limited emotional preparation, trying to find himself in a role that had not been designed to accommodate a person who was different from the man who held it before him. The general had fired Bobby from the company in 1965, which in practical terms resolved the question of whether Bobby would be his successor, and also represented the kind of personal rejection from a parent that tends to leave marks whether or not money cushions the landing. The circumstances of the firing were not dramatic. Bobby had worked for the company for years without distinguishing himself in the ways the general needed. He had tried. The trying was not enough. When the general finally removed him, it was with the same clean efficiency with which he removed anyone whose performance he found inadequate, which meant without much discussion and without what Bobby would have needed from his father to move forward productively, which was some acknowledgement that the failure was mutual, that the environment had not served the son any better than the son had served the environment. None of that happened. Bobby was simply gone from the company, left to organize the rest of his life around a fortune that had been structured by his father to last forever, and around a sense of his own adequacy that had been structured by his father to be perpetually in question. Bobby married Betty Wold, a woman from St. Paul, Minnesota, whose father was a physician and who brought into the marriage a warmth and groundedness that stood in some contrast to the Johnson family environment she was entering. They had 5 children together: Woody, born 1947, Libet, Keith, Billy, and Christopher. The family moved between residences as large wealthy families do, occupying houses in New York, New Jersey, and the Princeton estates that several generations of Johnsons had called home. From the outside, the picture was one of complete privilege. From the inside, by the accounts of people who were part of it, the picture was more complicated. Bobby Johnson was not consistently present to his children in the emotional sense. He was dealing with his own unresolved relationship to his father, his own sense of having been found insufficient, his own difficulty translating the structure of inherited wealth into any kind of purposeful identity. Betty Johnson, who remarried after Bobby's death and became Betty Johnson Bushnell, described a home life in which the children had everything except the one thing they most needed. What that thing was, in her telling, was a father who knew how to be fully there. Not a father who provided for them, which Bobby did. Not a father who was physically present, which he also managed, but a father who understood how to be emotionally available to children in the sustained, attentive, responsive way that actually shapes a person's interior landscape in the years when it is still forming. Whether Bobby could not provide this or simply did not know how is a question the record cannot answer clearly. Probably it was both. Bobby died in 1970 at the age of 52. His children were still young. He had not found whatever he was looking for, had not resolved the estrangement from his father, had not built an identity that was his own rather than a diminished version of the General's. He died before Keith. He died before Billy. He died without knowing the scale of the losses that were still coming for the family he had started. 1975 arrived with its two deaths arriving within weeks of each other, which is the kind of grief that does not leave a family the same. Keith Johnson was 27 years old. He was Bobby and Betty's second child, born in 1948, a year after his older brother Woody. He died of a cocaine overdose. He was found with a drug apparatus near his body, the details printed in newspapers in the blunt shorthand of police reports, without context, without the kind of account that might have illuminated what had brought a young man born into one of the richest families in America to that room on that floor. He was 27. He had not yet begun whatever his life was supposed to have been. The trust fund that had been growing in his name since before he was old enough to understand what it was, compounding year after year with no effort on his part, had been there his entire life as a kind of permanent promise. The promise had not extended to any of the things that actually hold a life together. Weeks later, Billy Johnson was dead. He was 23 years old, the fourth child, born in 1952. He had received his first trust fund disbursement approximately 2 years earlier, a sum reported to be around $10 million, the beginning of what was already becoming one of the largest personal fortunes any of them would ever hold. He was killed in Los Angeles in a motorcycle accident, his bike colliding with a parking meter at a speed that did not leave him any chance. He died with the money barely a year old in his hands, before he had done much of anything with it, before the question of what he might have built with it or spent it on or turned it into had any time to be answered. 2 brothers in a single year, the first to overdose and the second to a parking meter. And the losses came so quickly and with so little warning that the family, already holding more grief than it had known how to carry since Bobby died 5 years earlier, absorbed the new weight in the silence that very wealthy families tend to maintain around their most private catastrophes. Betty Johnson, who had already watched her husband die, who had already been navigating the particular difficulty of raising 5 children inside the Johnson fortune, without much of the structure that might have made the fortune useful rather than destabilizing, now had 2 dead sons. There was no public accounting of what that grief was like. There were no interviews, no public statements beyond the minimum required. The family closed around its losses the way it always had, with silence and with the inherited conviction that these were private matters that the outside world had no claim to understand. The trust instruments the General had designed 30 years earlier worked exactly as designed in the aftermath of those deaths. Keith had died without children. Billy had died without children. Their trust interests passed, per the terms the General had written into the instruments, to the surviving siblings. Woody Libet and Christopher became, as a direct consequence of their brothers' deaths, the wealthiest of their generation of Johnsons, their already substantial trust positions augmented by the portions that had belonged to the 2 young men who were now gone. This was not malice, and it was not even insensitivity on the General's part. He had been thinking about compounding and consolidation and the long-term integrity of the family's wealth position when he wrote those terms in 1944. He had not been thinking about what it would feel like to receive your dead brother's money, because he had designed the trusts from the position of someone solving a financial problem, and the financial problem had a clean solution. The emotional problem, the problem of what it means to inherit the portion that belonged to someone who died before they had a chance to use it, is not a problem that trust instruments address. The money kept growing. The family kept moving through the losses with the quiet that their world required of them. And the world outside kept buying bandages and baby powder and having no idea that any of this was happening inside the family whose name was on the label. Robert Wood Johnson IV, known as Woody, is the member of the Johnson family most recognizable to people of the present era. He owns the New York Jets, a professional football franchise he purchased in 2000 for approximately $600 million. He served as the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom from 2017 to 2020, appointed by President Trump, a role that put the Johnson name in diplomatic and political contexts that had nothing obvious to do with bandages or baby powder. He is, by any external measure, a man who has built a public life of real substance out of the circumstances he was born into. The path from the young man he was in his 20s to the man he became was not particularly straight. He stepped off a cliff at the University of Arizona in the late 1960s in an alcohol-involved accident that could very easily have killed him and did not. He completed his undergraduate degree over 7 years at a pace that reflected a young man who was not particularly pressed by necessity to finish anything quickly. The cousin who described him to a biographer as the ultimate frat boy in those years was not being entirely unkind, but the description fit the evidence available at the time. He did not know what he was for. He had access to everything the family name and fortune provided, which was essentially everything, and he moved through his early adulthood using that access without having yet found anything that organized it around a purpose. This is not unusual among people born into his circumstances. The fortune removed the ordinary pressures that tend to push people toward definition. Nobody needed Woody to do anything in particular. The trusts were growing without his involvement. The Johnson name opened doors whether or not he had done anything to merit what was on the other side of them. There was no external structure, no necessity that required him to become something specific rather than remaining something diffuse. He found his way eventually, and the way he found it says something important about the family story. What organized Woody eventually, at least in part, was his daughter. Casey Johnson was diagnosed with juvenile diabetes at the age of 8, and the diagnosis changed something in Woody Johnson's understanding of what he was responsible for. He co-authored a book with Casey at 14 about managing childhood diabetes. He became a genuine supporter of the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, not in the nominal way of wealthy people who attach their names to causes for the social benefit, but with real commitment of time and attention and money that lasted for decades. He cared about that cause in a way that was personal and evident. He knew, because the illness was in his house and in his daughter's body, what the disease required and what happened when its requirements were not met. The commitment did not save Casey, but it was real, and it represented something that the general's elaborate financial instruments had never produced in any of the family's earlier generations. A reason to care that came from inside a relationship rather than from the external pressure of necessity. Woody married Nancy Sale Frey in 1977, and they had 3 daughters together, Casey, Daisy, and Jaime. The marriage lasted until 2001, when they divorced. He married again in 2009 and had 2 sons with his second wife, Suzanne Ursha. He had built, by the time of the events surrounding Casey's death, a public identity that was stable and serious, and difficult to reduce to the simply inherited wealth story the family name might otherwise have produced. He had done more with the fortune and the name than many of his generation had managed. What he had not been able to do, what the fortune itself could not do, no matter how large it grew, was protect his oldest daughter from the combination of illness and dysfunction and distance that eventually killed her. There were years in which he worked at it. There were the book and the foundation and the intervention in 2005. There was the particular effort of a parent who understands abstractly what his child needs and finds himself, despite all resources, unable to be the specific person who can deliver it. The distance between Woody Johnson and Casey Johnson in the years before her death was not simply a father failing to show up. It was the accumulated exhaustion of a parent who had shown up in every way available to him and watched every arrival fail to hold. When he withdrew, eventually from active daily involvement in her life, it was a withdrawal born of grief rather than indifference, though from Casey's side the distinction may not have felt like a meaningful one. Casey Johnson was born in Florida on September 24, 1979. She grew up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan in the world of private schools and social access that the Johnson name and fortune provided. She attended the Chapin School, one of the most selective private schools in Manhattan, the same institution that had educated Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy and Vera Wang and several generations of women whose last names opened the same doors Casey's name opened. She was friends from childhood with Paris Hilton and Nikki Hilton, moved in the same circles, attended the same parties, occupied the same social world in which inherited fame and inherited money circulated together. She was diagnosed with juvenile diabetes at the age of 8. This is the fact around which everything else in her life organized itself, in ways that the tabloid coverage of her later years almost entirely missed. From the age of 8, Casey Johnson lived with a serious and potentially fatal illness that required constant management. The disease was unforgiving. Miss a dose of insulin, let the blood sugar spiral out of control for long enough, and the body entered diabetic ketoacidosis, a metabolic crisis that moved toward coma and death with a speed that left very little time for intervention. She had been hospitalized more than once because she had not taken her insulin. She knew what the illness required. She knew what happened when those requirements were not met, and she struggled, across her entire adult life, to meet them with consistency. She was not stupid, and she was not shallow, and she was not the simple socialite story the tabloids preferred. She was funny and perceptive, and possessed of a quality that several people who knew her described as painful self-awareness, the ability to see clearly what was happening to her while remaining unable to stop it. She co-wrote a book with her father at 14 about managing childhood diabetes. She attended Brown University for a semester. She worked as an intern. She tried acting. She adopted a daughter from Kazakhstan in 2007 and named her Ava Monroe, after Marilyn Monroe, a woman Casey spoke about throughout her life with the kind of complicated recognition that comes from seeing something of your own story in another person's destruction. She was offered a role by Paris Hilton to co-star in a reality television series. She turned it down. The role went to Nicole Richie. The series became The Simple Life. Casey said for years afterward that turning it down was the stupidest mistake of her life. Whether it would have given her enough of an anchor to hold her, enough of a purpose to organize the rest against, is a question that cannot be answered. What can be said is that she spent her 20s in an environment that provided everything except the structure that the illness she was managing required from her, and that the money which was supposed to protect her functioned in some ways as a buffer against the consequences that might otherwise have forced a reckoning sooner. Her father attempted an intervention in 2005. The intervention brought together the people closest to Casey, organized around the goal of getting her to address her substance use and her diabetes management and the spiral her life had been entering. It did not take. The intervention was a real attempt. The people in the room were people who cared about her. The failure was not from insufficient effort or insufficient love. It was the particular failure mode of an illness that requires the person inside it to want to change, and a psychological situation in which the resources available to address it, money, access, professional help, the attentiveness of wealthy and connected people, had all been tried without producing the necessary interior shift. By 2006, Woody had largely withdrawn from active daily involvement in Casey's life. The withdrawal was not indifference, though it felt like indifference from inside it. It was the particular exhausted grief of a parent who has tried everything available to him and watched all of it fail, and who has no remaining tools that he knows how to use. He said, in the period around Casey's death, that he would give all of the trust fund wealth aside to have back the brothers he had lost and the daughter he was losing. The fortune could not buy any of them back. It had never been designed to. In November of 2009, Casey was arrested in Los Angeles on charges that she had broken into the apartment of a former girlfriend and stolen $22,000 worth of clothing and personal items. She denied the allegations. Around the same time, by accounts collected by people covering the story, her house on Mulholland Drive was in a condition that reflected the complete breakdown of any functional domestic management. The electricity had been cut off. The swimming pool had turned green. Her car was being repossessed. Her mother's sale had taken Casey's 3-year-old daughter, Ava Monroe, out of the household after concerns about the conditions the child was living in. In December of 2009, Casey announced her engagement to a reality television personality via a video posted online and updated her social media account on December 29th with the words "Sweet Dreams" in the small hours of the morning. On January 4th, 2010, her maid found her body in the bedroom of her Mulholland Drive home. She had been dead for approximately 2 days. The Los Angeles County coroner determined the cause of death was diabetic ketoacidosis. She had not been taking her insulin. There were no drugs in her system. She had died of the disease she had managed, imperfectly, for 22 years, in a house where the electricity was off, estranged from her father, separated from her daughter. She was 30 years old. She was the great-great-granddaughter of the man who had helped found a company whose products had saved and extended the lives of millions of people around the world. She died of a condition that 100 years of medical progress had made entirely manageable for anyone who managed it. She had not managed it. And the fortune surrounding her family's name, growing in its trust instruments to numbers that defeated ordinary comprehension, had not managed it for her. Jamie Johnson is Woody Johnson's second cousin, born in 1979, the same year as Casey, the son of James Loring Johnson, who was himself the son of Seward I from his second marriage. Jamie grew up watching inherited wealth operate on the people around him, watching what it did and did not do for the members of his family, and arrived at his 21st birthday, the birthday on which his own trust fund was scheduled to mature, with an acute awareness that the thing he was about to receive had not served the people closest to him especially well. He was a history student at New York University when he started filming what would become Born Rich, and his original motivation was not documentary ambition or social critique, but something closer to self-protection. He had observed, in his words, that a lot of people with inherited wealth, including members of his own family, lived unproductive lives, and in some cases tragic and miserable lives, and he wanted to understand why before the same thing happened to him. He had watched enough of the family's history to know that the question was serious. He had watched his grandfather's will contest and the $25 million in legal fees it consumed. He had watched his older relatives navigate their inheritances with varying degrees of dysfunction. He understood from observation rather than theory that the money the general's trust instruments were about to deliver to him was a complicated gift. The film he made consists of Jamie Johnson interviewing other young heirs to great American fortunes, asking them about their relationship to wealth they had not earned, about the psychological weight of inheriting a famous name, about what it means to grow up knowing the money is coming, and knowing that its arrival will not answer the question of who you are. He interviewed Ivanka Trump, Georgina Bloomberg, and others who had grown up inside similar frameworks of inherited wealth and famous names. He also interviewed himself and included footage of his conversations with his father, James Loring Johnson, a deeply private man who had been raised in the Johnson family tradition of absolute silence around the subject of money, and who saw his son's project as a fundamental violation of that tradition and of the code by which the family operated. Those conversations between Jamie and his father, included in the film and fragments that accumulate over the documentary's running time, are among the most revealing passages in either of the two films Jamie Johnson made. Neither man says anything particularly dramatic. Neither of them raises his voice or makes an accusation. But watching them, you can see exactly the mechanism by which the family's silence had been transmitting itself across generations. The way the prohibition on discussing money was enforced not through explicit threat or instruction, but through a combination of disappointment and withdrawal that made the subject feel untouchable. The way a father who was by all accounts a warm and loving man in other respects became, on this specific topic, a wall. The way the son's decision to push against the wall was experienced by the father not as curiosity or courage, but as a form of betrayal. James Loring Johnson did not speak to his son for a period during the film's production. He remained, by his son's account, a man who could be warm and kind and who genuinely supported Jamie emotionally, even while being opposed to the project entirely. He simply believed that these things should not be said out loud. Jamie believed the opposite and said them out loud anyway on HBO in 2003 to an audience of millions. The film was nominated for 2 Emmy Awards. It made the argument, quietly and without polemic, that the secrecy around inherited wealth was itself a form of damage, that by treating enormous fortune as something that existed and should not be examined or named, Wealthy families were delivering to their children a resource that came without any of the preparation that made it navigable. The Johnson family history did not need to be framed or exaggerated to make the argument. It was already the argument. Keith Johnson was dead at 27. Billy Johnson was dead at 23. The will contest had cost $25 million in legal fees and produced no resolution. Casey was deteriorating in Los Angeles. The trust funds were growing. Nobody was talking about it. In 2006, Jamie made a second documentary, The 1%, about wealth inequality in America more broadly, using the family's experience as one lens through which to examine the wider social question of what it means to live in a country where an increasingly small number of people control an increasingly large share of the total wealth. By this point, the lawsuit over his grandfather's will was 20 years in the past. Grounds for Sculpture was operating in Hamilton, New Jersey. His cousin Casey was still alive and still deteriorating toward the death that would come 3 years later. The family remained, in the way of all large, wealthy families with complicated histories, unresolved and largely silent about what it was that needed to be resolved. What Jamie Johnson built with the access the family name provided was not an institution in the way Seward Jr. had built Grounds for Sculpture. It was something smaller and less tangible, but in its own way, no less honest. An accounting of what the fortune had cost the people who received it, told from inside the receiving at personal cost and without the protection of silence. He lost friendships. He strained family relationships that had already been strained by decades of legal battles and estrangements. He violated the code that had been the family's primary method of self-protection for generations. What he got in return was something the trust funds, by their nature, could never supply. A piece of work that was genuinely his, that required real personal courage to produce, that cost him something real and gave him in exchange the only thing that the general's elaborate financial structures had consistently failed to deliver to the people who inherited them. He had found, through the act of making something honest at his own expense, what the general's trust instruments could not engineer, a reason for being that was entirely his own. What remains is worth taking account of. Johnson & Johnson, the company the three brothers founded in 1886 on Neilson Street in New Brunswick, with 14 employees and a borrowed idea, is one of the most valuable healthcare corporations in the world. It is ranked consistently among the top 50 on the Fortune 500. It employs approximately 138,000 people around the world. In 2023, it spun off its consumer products division into a separate company called Kenvue, and the Band-Aids and the baby powder now sit under a different corporate name. But the pharmaceutical and medical technology business that Johnson & Johnson retained is still one of the most formidable in its field. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which received the bulk of the general's estate when he died in January of 1968, has grown into one of the largest health-focused philanthropic organizations in the United States, funding research and public health programs across the country. Grounds for Sculpture is still operating in Hamilton, New Jersey, 42 acres of outdoor museum, built by a man who had been fired from the family company and found sculpture instead. These are the institutions that endure. They are doing, by and large, what the people who built them intended. They are not the story. The story is what happened to the family the general tried to protect. Seward I spent his life looking for closeness and finding it at the very end in a way that divided his family against itself and produced the longest, most expensive will contest in American legal history up to that point. Seward II was fired from the family company at 32 and went on to build something on 42 acres in New Jersey that is still there, still serving the public, still outlasting the man who made it. Bobby Johnson died at 52, fired from his father's company, unable to find whatever resolution would have made the life he had been given feel like something that belonged to him. Keith died at 27, Billy died at 23. Woody built a public life and bought a football team and served as an ambassador and watched his oldest daughter come apart inside the fortune that was supposed to protect her. Casey Johnson died on her bedroom floor at 30 years old with no drugs in her system and no insulin in her body, in a house where the electricity was off and the swimming pool was green, and the wooden gates at the end of the driveway bore the name Grumble Not. Jamie Johnson turned a camera on the problem, lost friends over the decision, and kept making films anyway. The general set out to protect his family. He designed instruments of such durability and precision that the wealth he had helped build would compound through every generation, immune to the spending habits of individuals and the erosion of time. He succeeded at this beyond any reasonable expectation. A block of 100 shares worth $3,750 in 1944 was worth $12 million by the century's end, and the people who held those shares through the trust instruments the general designed had done nothing to produce that growth except exist. They had been protected financially in a way that very few human beings in the history of the world have been protected. What the protection could not provide, and what the general does not appear to have thought much about, was the thing that human beings actually need to sustain themselves across a lifetime, which is the sense that what they do matters, that they are building something by effort and choice that would not otherwise exist, that the world registers their presence in some way that is not simply a function of the name they were born with or the fortune they were born into. Some members of the family found that sense anyway. Seward Jr. found it in sculpture and foundries and 42 acres of outdoor museum. Jamie Johnson found it in documentary films that cost him relationships and gave him something no trust could deliver. These were the exceptions, the people who used the fortune as a tool rather than letting the fortune define the entirety of what they were. The others, the ones who struggled most visibly, were not weaker or worse as people. They were people who received something enormous without any framework for carrying it, and who spent their lives inside that particular difficulty with varying degrees of awareness and varying degrees of help. The difficulty was real. The money did not make it easier. In several cases, the money made it considerably harder by removing the ordinary pressures that tend to push people toward definition, and replacing them with nothing but access and the expectation that access would be enough. The trust instruments the general designed are still operating. The stock is still compounding. The foundation the general funded with the bulk of his estate is still distributing money to health causes across America. The company the three brothers started in that rented building in 1886 is still making things that extend and save lives. The general built a machine, and it runs. The question that the Johnson family story keeps posing across 5 generations and multiple lifetimes and more grief than any one family's silence can hold is whether the machine, in providing everything it was designed to provide to the people inside the family, also took something from them that money has no mechanism to replace. The question does not have a clean answer. It simply has a record, and the record is what it is, and the bandages are still in the medicine cabinet, and the family is still there behind the name, on the label, still moving through the consequences of what the general built for them and could not quite build into them. The name on the label outlasted the people behind it, as names tend to do. The 3 brothers who started in that rented building are long gone. The general who turned their company into a global corporation is long gone. Bobby and Keith and Billy and Casey are gone. Seward the sculptor, who made something genuinely worth making in 42 acres in Hamilton, is gone too. The trusts compound in the absence of the people who are supposed to benefit from them. That is the nature of the instrument. It was designed to be permanent, and it is. The people inside it were not. What they left behind, what any of them managed to leave behind, was the question the general never asked and the family never answered cleanly. Not what can the money do, but what can you do, separate from the money. That will mean something when both you and the money are gone. Some of them found an answer. The rest of the story is the space between the question and the silence where an answer should have been. If you found value in this story tonight, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. These documentaries take real research and real care to produce, and your support is what makes it possible for us to keep making them. We will see you in the next one.